Good evening. Welcome to the Resolution Foundation, both the people who have come here in person and also our online participants. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm delighted that today we're going to hear from Carl Frey about his new book. I've got the proof copy that I read over the summer, and much more important, the final copy. Carl assures me that the conclusions have not radically changed from the version I read in July. And it's a fantastic book, How Progress Ends. Carl, of course, has already written important and influential books, notably The Technology Trap. His new book has just today been shortlisted by the Financial Times for their Business Book of the Year award. So it shows the impact that it's having. It's been very well reviewed, came out only last week, but already people are talking about it, and we're delighted here at Resolution with our interest in economic performance and innovation to be hosting this discussion. So Carl, first of all, over to you to set out the themes of your book for a few minutes. Then Carl and I will have a bit of a discussion and then turn to our online participants as well as people physically in the room for your questions. Carl, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind and generous introduction, David. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today and sharing some thoughts about my latest book called How Progress Ends. Now, the book is not quite as gloomy as the title might suggest, but it's sort of slightly pushing back against the narrative that technological change, technological progress is something inevitable, that is just, we're set up for this great acceleration in technological progress and growing economic prosperity as a consequence. And of course, if progress was inevitable, you might ask, why did it take humanity 200,000 years to have an industrial revolution? Why is it that not every place around the world today is rich and prosperous? Well, in principle, they could all adopt modern technology. And why is it that former technology leaders, such as the place we're currently at, is facing stagnant productivity growth? And in fact, if you take out London from Britain, the rest is roughly, I think, in GDP per capita terms, on par with the state of Mississippi. So that's, roughly speaking, how well things are going at the moment. Now, I'm obviously not the first to write about the wealth and poverty of nations, so let me try to situate the book a little bit in the literature. So broadly speaking, scholars of development, economic historians, economists have tend to emphasize three factors in explaining differences in GDP per capita across space, those being geography, culture, and institutions. The problem I think those factors have is that they are basically more or less fixed, at least in shorter time spans. And so, for example, consider the Soviet Union. Back in the 1950s, it was growing rapidly. There was a lot of concern in the United States that it would soon find itself overtaken. Leading economists like Paul Samuelson were predicting that the Soviet Union would overtake the US by the 1980s, but more maybe by the 1980s, but more likely by the 1990s. And needless to say, the geography of the Soviet Union was basically the same in the 1950s as before it collapsed. You might argue that culture changed slightly because no amount of barbed wire could prevent the radio and television waves from Europe traveling right through the Iron Curtain, and so people got more exposed to Western culture and ideas, but I think you would be hard-pressed to say that Soviet culture changed markedly, and if anything, it became more open, and you would associate that with progress rather than decline. And I think it's fair to say that the Soviet Union didn't have anything like secure property rights in the 50s or in the 80s, and so clearly you can grow without them, but clearly with them you may not grow indefinitely either. And so the point I'm trying to make in the book is that the Soviet model worked reasonably well for catch-up growth. Soviet delegations took advantage of Ford's open door policy, and numerous delegations visited. They did fairly reasonably well in building up their own car industry and associated industries. And for some time, as long as production processes were fairly standardized, it was relatively straightforward for Soviet bureaucrats to benchmark performance between factories and hold factory managers accountable that way. But it was much harder as they approached the technological frontier, as the mass production system petered out in the 70s, as something new was needed for growth. That new thing was the computer, to which Soviet contributions were basically none. And it's harder, needless to say, to benchmark performance against something that is new. Moreover, I would argue, and argue in the book, is that decentralization is really important for economic performance at the frontier. So if you were an inventor in the Soviet Union, you had a great idea, you could go to the Red Army and ask it for funding. If they turned you down, you may have 2 or 3 different options. If they declined, your idea would die with you. That's quite different from the US system, where Bessemer Venture famously declined to invest in Google back in '99. And that might seem like a bad idea with the benefit of hindsight, but it also illustrates that Google was not a safe bet at the time. Alta Vista and Yahoo were leading in search, and so you actually do need to invest in something to know whether it will catch on or not. And more importantly, the fact that Bessemer didn't invest didn't curtail the rise of Google, because others stepped in and invested. And so at the frontiers of innovation, a more decentralized system permits more technological trajectories to be explored, and that is what happened to a greater degree in the United States. Now, the book is not just a comparative analysis of the US and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union did eventually collapse, and as Chalmers Johnson famously remarked at the time, the Cold War is over and Japan won. And that was very much the sentiment of the 1980s, because back then it was Japan that was meant to be just at the cusp of overtaking the United States. A lot of people worried that Japan was doing what it was previously doing in automotive, whereby Toyota outcompeted both General Motors and Ford. And the same process was happening in consumer electronics and in semiconductors as well. And so you could easily have made a case back then that people were onto something, because production, even in cutting-edge technologies, were shifting towards Japan. Yet in the 1990s, growth in Japan peters out. In 1995, you see a productivity upsurge in the United States. And again, I think the key explanation is the same one. Keiretsu conglomerates in Japan were good at catch-up growth. They were good at taking existing technology, improving it, and scaling, but they did not support the kind of dynamism that you saw in the US. And I think competition policy was absolutely critical to this process in the US case. The launch of the antitrust lawsuit against IBM essentially forced it to unbundle hardware and software and opened up the market for new competitors like Microsoft to enter the scene. And the breakup of AT&T meant that when the National Science Foundation released ARPANET, the predecessor to the modern internet, to the world, it couldn't be bottlenecked in the boardroom of AT&T if they saw no immediate commercial benefit of it. And so the internet was permitted to evolve organically through its users and new firms emerging to build new businesses around it. Now today, of course, the concern is about China, and there is no way of explaining away the huge economic strides that China has made. But it's also important to actually try to understand it more deeply. And I would argue, learn from these past examples as well. Because the way China grew rich was not, initially at least, through top-down industrial policy. Unlike the Soviet Union, where industries, whether it was steel or railroads, were managed centrally from Moscow in functional departments, the Chinese economy was much more decentralized and run by provincial governors who competed against each other in terms of positions within the Communist Party. And that had a number of effects. One is that businesses could reasonably expect that their investment would be protected from the grabbing hand of government. It also meant that different localities could experiment with different types of policies, and indeed economic activity moved quite swiftly from Beijing, which pursued more top-down industrial policy, through the new special economic zones in the south. Now, China today is moving more away from that model, more activities being centralized in Beijing. Political objectives are taking precedent over economic objectives. It's harder to mobilize private firms for those objectives because they're more interested in market share and profits. And what that means is that more resources are being allocated again towards state-owned enterprises, which have been a drag on innovation and productivity in the past. And we're seeing a pretty sharp decline in business dynamism in China as a consequence of this. We also see stagnant productivity growth, even negative by some estimates, since the Great Recession. And unfortunately, we're seeing a similar trend in the US, which is actually becoming more like China. Back in 2000, the expectation was that China would become more like the United States. Now the reverse seems to be happening. And so over the past 2 decades, we've seen a sharp rise in things like lobbying expenditure. We've seen a sharp decline in business dynamism. We've seen a sharp deceleration in productivity growth. And under the current administration, we're seeing a doubling down on some of the policies that have been counterproductive over the past couple of years. And so, the tariff policies of the first Trump administration were then doubled down on by the Biden administration and then vastly accelerated by the second Trump administration. And in addition to that, there's a host of tariff exemptions, which aids powerful incumbents, which are better placed in navigating the systems that have more political capital than smaller firms. And I think more broadly, it's also likely to lead to a different kind of manager in many American companies. You're less likely to see the tech manager, more likely to see the kind of manager that's good at politics and building relationships in Washington. Now, the hope right now, I think, for many is that AI is going to revive productivity growth going forward. And you might argue that the kind of consolidation that we've seen in many industries would be good for growth in AI if scaling was all you needed. So if everything we needed was more compute, large data sets, you might argue that consolidation is good. But that's not what we've been seeing, right? So between 2019 and 2024, we've seen large language models scale by 10,000x. Yet we saw basically very little improvement in performance on basic reasoning tests like ArcAGI, which introduces really novel problems to these algorithms. And so what this underlines is that the models we currently have, they do very well in memorizing stuff. They do not so well when it comes to generalizing beyond the training data. And what we need is models that are more resilient to changing circumstances. And that means that we need more innovation. And again, I argue in the book, decentralized exploration. So with that, I've probably spoken longer than I should. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you very much. And it is striking that the final chapters of Carl's book do paint quite a pessimistic picture of both China and the US. And of course, there is behind this a literature that just, in general, science innovation is getting tougher. The amount of effort, we think, it's a good example of your opening observation, we think we fantastically got Moore's law working year after year, but the amount of effort required in order to deliver the improvements in Moore's law has got greater and greater and greater. So to what extent is your pessimism specifically about social and economic circumstances in the US and China, which might change, or to what extent is it a wider view about where science and tech stands now with with pessimism in general that the state of where we are in science and tech is not going to drive innovation and growth?
So what's completely astounding to me is that, it's hard to think of two more transformational technologies than the personal computer and the internet, right? So connected some of the best and brightest minds around the world, gave everybody more or less the world's stored knowledge in their pockets, aids the research process tremendously, and all we get is sort of a little bit of a significant but fairly short-lived upsurge in productivity, 95 to around 2004, mostly confined to the United States. And so I think we have to ask ourselves more fundamentally, if we have these amazing technologies and that's all we get, is there something that's fundamentally wrong? Are we, to some degree, bottlenecking our ability to use technology effectively? One point that I didn't make in my presentation that I think deserves to be made is that, business dynamism is not just a drag on innovation. I think it also shapes the direction of innovation. Right. So large firms have scale. They're more likely to invest in process innovation and automation. Smaller firms don't have scale. They're much more likely to invest in products that create new types of industries and new types of work. And I think that's the key driver of just job creation, but growth and prosperity. So if everything we've done since 1800 was automation, we had productive agriculture and cheap textiles, but that'd be about it, with some exaggeration, that we wouldn't have antibiotics, vaccines, rockets, airplanes, etc. And most of those innovations and ideas have come from new enterprises.
Can you see either if either the US or the China were to escape from your pessimistic scenarios, how might that happen? Are there elsewhere in the world more optimistic places where and I guess it's not the EU, but is there somewhere else where you feel more optimistic about future growth and innovation coming from? Or is it the equivalent of the progressive movement in the US, which you praise in your book? Give us a sense of where we might hope for some better performance.
So there's obviously scope for a lot of catch-up growth around the world. I think that generative AI, broadly speaking, is reducing barriers to entry in professional services. It's little bit like what Uber did to taxi services. With GPS technology, knowing the name of every street in London was no longer a particularly valuable skill, and then with the app matching supply and demand, anybody with a driver's license could get into his or her car and top up their incomes. And that meant more competition for incumbent drivers. Obviously, the difference with professional services is that those are traded. And so if AI reduces the productivity differential between a worker in Manila and a worker in London, and the wage differential between the two is an order of magnitude, you would think that more work would shift towards places like Manila. And so I'm more optimistic about those places for catch-up growth. I'm not more optimistic about frontier innovation in any other place than the United States or China.
Right. Now, Carl's book is magisterial and basically reviews where economic growth has been delivered across the world, across history, with fantastic essays on Prussia after the Napoleonic War and China. But the UK gets a modest slot because you could argue, well, it is where it started. And it is relevant, I think, for your wider thesis, just briefly to reflect on the UK, because what Carl really argues for is strong and competent government, sufficiently strong to stop incumbents obstructing innovation and insurgents, and not captured by the incumbents to block the insurgents. So it's got to be a strong government, but also doing the right thing. I hope that's a fair summary of what you're looking for. And the first place where Carl finds this model is 18th century Britain, 19th century Britain. And this is a very good physical location to be considering that hypothesis, because if you walk from here to Parliament down Birdcage Walk, you will walk past the Institute of Civil Engineers, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. Why are they all clustered here? I'm sure everybody here goes to meetings there. And you may have wondered why they all clustered here. The answer is they all gathered here to get railway bills through Parliament. They were the original lobbyists. They assembled to draft and get railway bills through. But the railway bills were Parliament and not full democracy being used to overrule local property rights to deliver technological change. And compare that with the difficulty of building a fast rail link between San Francisco and Los Angeles today. So I guess, it's wonderful we have that niche in your history, but you could argue that balance that you identify is really quite hard to accomplish. And in a way, is your pessimism because you think accomplishing it today is difficult? Is there any place where you can see it happening? How could you have a progressive movement in America trying to reverse this balance? Give us a bit of optimism about finding that sweet spot again.
Well, the reason the book is called How Progress Ends is that exactly that balance is notoriously hard. So I'm sorry, but if you want optimism, don't invite an economist from Sweden of all places. Look, I think the US has historically been pretty good at finding that balance. I think Britain was pretty good at finding that balance at the time. I think, unfortunately, right now, we're not quite finding that right balance. And that's true of the US, it's true of Britain, and it's true of the European Union more broadly. And so, being here at the stage with somebody who's actually in politics, I will feel silly to telling the audience how hard this must be. But in the end of the day, I think it's necessary, and so the hope is that the book might at least play a small contribution in rallying people to the pursuit of progress, because what you need to check vested interest is a mobilized society. That's what Mankiewicz Olson told us a long time ago. And so to actually get politics to deliver, you need to have a society that is advocating for checking vested interests, and I'm not quite seeing that at the moment.
Absolutely. And of course, one of the things that I was discussing with Carl before he came down, I chair the Regulatory Innovation Office, whose job is to try to ensure regulations do not stand in the way of innovation and new technologies, and we face exactly the challenges you describe in your book. Now, when I look at the questions that have been upvoted on Slido, they are heavily about AI. Risks from AI, particularly labour unrest and job losses from AI. What are the job prospects for younger people from AI? And of course, you probably, the first time when you commanded great attention a decade or so ago now was when you warned about enormous job losses from AI, 47% or something. And you've since then, I know, looked at that further and reappraised. Just given your record in that area, just give us your assessment of how AI and the labour market are performing now.
So back in 2013, we basically identified 3 key bottlenecks to automation. So creativity, complex social interactions, and the ability to navigate unstructured environments. And so I think there's been some progress in all of those domains, but more limited in some. So when it comes to complex social interactions, chatbots are off the charts better than they were 10 years ago. I do think, though, that if anything, that increases the value of in-person communication, and so I think that remains a bottleneck. Creativity is hard because it's very hard to define what creativity is. Is it creative to write something in the style of William Shakespeare? The reason that algorithms can do that is that Shakespeare existed.
Yes.
But I'm happy to grant that AI can do a lot of things more creatively than I can. So it's hard to argue against the case that there is no creativity. At the same time, I think it's very little in terms of frontier creativity. So if you took an LLM, you trained it upon everything that was available up until 1900, and you asked it, will humans ever be able to fly? It would have looked at the long list of failed experiments of humans attempting to fly. It would have maybe looked at 2 birds as evidence that flight is possible in principle, but even there's no bird that weighs more than 30 pounds that's able to get off the ground. Larger birds like ostriches don't fly, and so by all likelihood that LLM would not have been of huge help to the Wright brothers. So I think when it comes to frontier creativity, humans still hold a comparative advantage, and then there are all sorts of downstream impacts on robotics, but I still think that we're not anywhere close to having a automated cleaner or anything like that. Generative AI, as I mentioned, I think is not quite a full-fledged automation technology, because you do need a human in the loop for most activities, and so I think of it more as reducing barriers to entry in more relatively skilled work. And so we didn't quite envision those developments that we've seen in generative AI back in 2013, but I think they are of a different nature than what we were looking at the time.
So you are not as pessimistic now as you were then about jobs, though you are pessimistic still about overall economic performance and growth.
Well, I'm not sure if I was that pessimistic back then. So look, is 47% a big figure or not? I mean, it depends on the time frame of which those jobs are automated away, right? So back in 1900,
right,
more than 47% worked in agriculture, and so I don't think that my views have changed that much. I don't think we're about to have mass unemployment. I don't thought that back then. But there's certainly some things that have taken much longer than I expected. So autonomous cars, for example, a lot of the jobs that we saw exposed to automation were in autonomous vehicles that have taken much longer to materialize. I still think it will happen. I still think it will be disruptive for people working in transportation and logistics, but it's not the end of...
Right, so the kind of labour market change we're used to is, coal mining disappears and typing pools go and people become personal trainers, and an endless process of renewal and reshaping of jobs.
Yeah, and look, I mean, if you take my example of reducing barriers to entry, in the end of the day, for the London worker, the difference may not be that different. So if you lose your job to offshoring or to automation, what does it matter to your personal fate? And so, I think there's going to be a lot of changes because of AI. I particularly worry about, sense of a loss of status of people working in professional services, and I think a lot of people are not ready for that.
I think I'm going to count that as close to optimism, actually, because we're not, and of course it was a misreading, a misunderstanding to have said you were going to be predicting mass unemployment. You're predicting labour market change continuing, driven by AI, but perhaps not as rapid as we may have thought a decade ago. Right. It was interesting. That was a main theme on Slido as well. So we'll now turn to people here who may have some comments or questions. I see several. Let's start at the front here. Give your name, Jonathan. It's great that you're here.
Jonathan Haskell, Imperial College. Thanks very much for the talk, and I enjoyed reading the book very much. I have to say, though, having read the book, Carl, I'm in a very different place to you. I'm much more optimistic, and so can I try that thought on you? And I think it's a rather unfair thought, and it is this. The last couple of years of American productivity data show the US productivity performance absolutely amazing. I mean, it's just doing incredibly well. It's looking much like the early years of the ICT revolution. Now, of course, the data probably weren't available to you because of the time lags involved in writing the books. That's why I say it's a slightly unfair criticism. But it seems to me that if those data do turn out to be a trend, and maybe it's just a blip from a couple of years, since they show strong productivity improvements in the information and communication sector and increasing productivity improvements in the sectors which are using all of this, like retailing, that, as I say, is a force for me to be very optimistic. So I just wonder if you have a reaction to that. Again, apologies, slightly unfair question, perhaps. Thanks very much.
But nonetheless, a very good question. So, I think it's hard to extrapolate from that. And so the question is it a blip, or are we at the beginning of something that might accelerate? And I'm totally open to that AI could deliver something like the productivity upsurge we saw during the ICT revolution, but that was not particularly long sustained and actually quite disappointing compared to what we saw in the post-war years in terms of sustaining productivity growth. And so, if we get that, that's good. That's certainly an improvement. It doesn't quite take us back to the days of electricity and the internal combustion engine in terms of the decades-long productivity streak that we had. I think the reason I'm maybe a little bit more pessimistic is that, first of all, if we look at the latest census data, you see that firms with more than 250 employees, they're actually scaling back AI use at the moment. That's also just a blip, so it's hard to draw sort of conclusions from that, but AI use is actually falling since the summer, and so that gives me a little bit of a pause and cause for concern. I think many of the envisioned applications, like in drug discovery, are potentially important, but 80% of the costs are in phase 3 clinical trials, and so unless you aid that particular part a lot through AI, you're unlikely to see as significant gains there that some people may hope. And so I think there are just a lot of bottlenecks in various industries that are hard to overcome, and most of the use cases I see are about automation and process improvement, and not things that I would suspect would turn into something like the automotive industry with all its supplier industries, etc., etc. And so I think that leaves me a little bit more pessimistic than you are, but I wouldn't exclude the possibility that we are at the cusp of something new, but I don't quite see the foundations for making that sustain.
Right. Another question, yes, there.
My name's Sarah Cowley. I don't work in AI tech field. I've previously been a GP. I was just wondering what the dangers of the US big technology AI companies being aligned to the authoritarian Trump regime, and obviously Chinese companies being aligned with the authoritarian Chinese government are for countries like our own.
Mm-hmm. Carl?
Well, so I'm not sure if I'm best placed to comment on the political consequences of that, but a topic I do talk a lot about in the book is the fact that more centralized economies tend to favor incumbents and large firms, and what we're seeing in the United States right now is no exception to that. And so if you take a look at the tariffs, for example, and the exemptions, who is benefiting from that? Well, it's a couple of firms that can navigate that complex system and get those exemptions. And so I think America is drifting more and more towards crony capitalism. And, the golden shares in Intel, which is supposedly just the beginning, at least according to the Trump administration itself, looks very much at what you're seeing in China. And so, of course, that's very much worrying indeed. It's hard to know exactly how to respond. Is this sort of solution to that sovereign AI in Europe? I think that's, a noble goal. I think it's also very hard. Europe did Airbus, and that turned out to be a successful endeavor. But that was in a relatively mature technology. So, like the last big invention, jet engine, had already been invented, and so the target was relatively clear. There were a lot of initiatives in Europe as well to seed domestic semiconductor industries, which all failed. That was more of a dynamic industry. The target was moving. It's much harder. How should Europe do sovereign AI today? Well, we don't even know what's the future of AI. Is it large language models? Is it small language models? Is it something else? It's much harder when the target is moving. And so, I think the best Europe can do to divorce itself from the United States is probably double down on open source, hope that most of the value will be in the application layer, and rather than trying to seed its own technology giants. And by the way, just one brief point, if I may. I think we ought to ask ourselves a more fundamental question, which is why don't we have these companies to begin with? And I think a big part of that is that firms in Europe don't have a large homogeneous market to scale into the way firms have in the US and China. Even within the European Union, which Britain, needless to say, is no longer part of, barriers to trade in services, according to IMF, amount to 110% tariff. So Trump Liberation Day tariffs inside Europe, and sort of that more fragmented market caps the return to innovation, I think, inside the European Union. And I think that's the sort of key challenge we have to deal with.
And there is an irony there, because your book is very good on Europe. When Europe compared with China 100, 200 years ago, if the prince didn't like the poetry you were writing or the research you were doing, you could travel over a border and be in a different nation state. And the diversity then was the advantage. But I think you're now clearly more pessimistic about that same diversity in today's economy. Now I see several, we might take 2 or 3 interventions now. Let's start with the gentleman here.
Thanks. I'm David Wood from London Futurists. I want to build on the question that Jonathan asked. And Carl, as you know, I'm very sympathetic to your analysis, but I want to challenge you on your thesis that AI is running out of steam for radical innovation. I think, on the contrary, there is signs that there is lots of really interesting things happening in AI. The protein folding of AlphaFold is giving rise to isomorphic labs. Here is a spin-out from DeepMind that already has a rival in silico medicine. And it is true that there will be a challenge of getting drugs through phase 3, but both of these companies are trying to identify ahead of time which drugs are more likely to succeed in phase 3 rather than the large failure rates. And it's a bit early to say, but in silico medicine from Alex Zavaronkov does seem to have some good track record on that. It's not just the breakthroughs in AlphaFold and protein folding, there's breakthroughs in mass. In July, there was remarkable performance in the International Mass Olympiad. For the first time, AI is performed at the gold level on completely unseen tests. And finally, there's a whole lot of interesting things happening in new types of hardware. In the UK, there's Literal Labs, who are doing very high performance, low power computing. There's neuromorphic computing, moreover. So my challenge to you is, isn't there a lot still happening in the world of AI? So it's not just going to be taking advantage of the existing AIs, which probably is the cause of the productivity gains that's just been mentioned, but there's a lot more just around the corner too.
Anybody else anybody else joining in on that theme? Do you want to comment on that sort of? Let's comment. Then I'll go over to the other side of the room.
So I'm also very impressed with what's been happening in AI over the past couple of years. Make no mistake about that. So my point was more that the returns to just scaling are running out, and there's a lot of good ideas, I think, out there. There are a lot of firms competing with maybe somewhat different ideas, and I think we're going to get progress in AI going forward as well. At the same time, I would say that AI is probably a better tutor than any subject, than anybody but the sort of world's leading experts in some domains. It's actually really, really good. And I'm surprised in a way how little that matters, at least so far. And I'm even more, and I think part of the reason for that is that it's very good in static environments still. It's not very good in dynamic environments. Anthropic used Claude to run a vending machine as an experiment, right? It's not a very complex business by any stretch of the imagination. It didn't do particularly well. So I'm not saying that these problems cannot be solved and there won't be progress in AI, but even if there is tremendous progress, it's progress in intelligence, and intelligence is an input. The reason that the Democratic Republic of Congo is poor is not because of a lack of intelligence, nor is a lack of intelligence the main reason that our economies, I would argue, are stagnant today. So still, I think there is a lot of bottlenecks out there that even if we get this accelerating improvement in AI, means that the impact of productivity could be less than a lot of people expect.
Okay, now there's two hands over there, and let's take those two questions, please.
My name's Helen Carasso. Thank you very much. You talked about bottlenecks. One you haven't talked about is the extent to which the appetite to spend time on developing innovation may have changed. We live in a world where people expect short-term returns. Is AI possibly a solution to our need to get quick answers that might enable more people to be effective in innovation who currently don't have backers who allow them to take time?
And gentleman there.
My name is Neil Koenig, a freelance journalist. Many years ago, I made a program about the so-called productivity paradox, where the trillions that have been invested in computers and IT didn't show up in the figures. And I wonder if you're saying that is still with us.
Yeah, two related questions again. What are your comments?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons, possibly, that we haven't seen this sustained upsurge in innovation resulting from the computer revolution is that people do a lot more projects at any given point in time. And so we do have some research showing that the more projects you do at a given time, the less likely you are to make a breakthrough at a given time. And so I think a risk with AI is that we're opting for more, we drill more holes rather than sort of digging deeper. And so there may be some institutional factor that rewards quantity over breakthroughs and quality, and I'm not sure whether it's about individual risk appetite or something else. Regarding the Solow paradox, well, it turned out to be wait and see, and then computers emerged in the productivity statistics back in the 90s. I would be very surprised if we don't see anything of a productivity upsurge if we wait and see because of AI. But I think we need something more profound than a decade-long upsurge in productivity growth to solve most of our economic problems, including our demographic challenges.
Very interesting. Any questions on this side of the room? Just checking. Can I press you on a sort of policy issue then, which is that you've got a very clear and powerful account in your book of how governments should function in order to enable innovation and insurgence and new ways of doing things, and not be captured by guilds or indeed by property rights that are so excessive that they act as a barrier to new technologies. And as I said, I wrestle with this at the Regulatory Innovation Office, where we are trying to work through a regulatory system that has some of those problems. What is it? And there are some other books, and one thinks of Abundance, some Vetocracy. There are books around which argue, as Manke Olsen did in the 1970s, one of your heroes and mine, about this. What do you think governments could do in Britain or America as it is today to tackle that problem? If they bought your analysis, what then happens? What is the agenda for someone sitting in town? Think of Minu Shafik, who worked with us on Economy 2030, the new economic advisory number 10. What does she do?
So I'm not sure if I'm best placed to comment on the politics of doing it, but in Britain I think there are three things that are really important. So one is cost of energy. If you want to scale and build stuff, you need cheap energy. Right. Second, you need decent infrastructure. In order to scale, Britain has a huge infrastructure deficit more broadly. Thirdly, you need markets. Britain is not big enough, and Britain needs Europe. Europe, unfortunately, is too fragmented too, and so you would need to try to convince the European Union to dismantle some of the barriers in its markets for services and then become a part of the European Union again. So those would be my policy recommendations, and I'm sure people will have a blast with it.
Well, I think that's a great list. So that is, I think you've just set out a Resolution Foundation research program for the next year. Energy costs, certainly, infrastructure, EU single market. I must say, having chaired until recently Innovate Cambridge, it is striking when you look at what you need to do to help Cambridge grow further, faster. The agenda is absolutely classic stuff. People would like, indeed, better access to the grid with affordable electricity. They would not like to have water supply constraints, which act as a constraint on building new things, and they'd like better transport links, particularly railways. In fact, they want some late 19th century, early 20th century technologies a century later in order to enable Cambridge to grow. That's the agenda. Any other questions from our audience? Yes, gentleman there, where the microphone is just coming over now.
This is probably a question coming from a place of profound ignorance, but I'm curious what you think about India and the possibilities there, thinking about top-down governments, not, I wouldn't call it a homogenous market, but a large one, even if it's got a lot of heterogeneity, things like that.
Thank you so much. It's a very good question. Yes, as it is, the book covers different parts of the world and has a discussion of India. What's the answer to that, Carl?
So, I think part of India's challenge has been maybe part of what's been Britain's challenge too, which is that it hasn't historically been very good at scaling. So Britain grew rich at a time when industry was small scale, and what constituted large-scale industry in Britain at the time was small-scale by modern standards. And so I think, like in Britain, there's a lot of veto points. In India, there's a lot of intersecting bodies with no clear authority to do things like building railroads, for example. And so the efforts to build new high-speed rail in India, for example, have been much slower than in China for that particular reason. And so India, I think, has greater fragmentation that can be good for innovation, but it's not particularly good for scaling. And I think that's been a drag on manufacturing in India. India, I should say, though, has benefited, I think, quite a lot from the English language, and it's become an offshoring hub for many services as a consequence of that. And so, Indian institutions are probably a better fit to some degree for future of service trade than Chinese institutions are. More people feel comfortable transferring their data to a democracy than an autocracy. But that being said, I still think it faces these challenges around scaling.
Interesting, thank you. And another question at the back there.
Thank you. Jeremy Carver, lawyer, not academic. Can I come back on your point, David, which when you made your intervention evoking the British Industrial Revolution, and the question I'm proposing is, have academics sufficiently understood why it was that during that extraordinarily long period of constructive redundancy, the bottlenecks gave way and allowed it to happen? Because surely there must be something to be learnt from that. It seems to me that one of the prime factors why it gave way was not a matter of being able to build a scale. It was a matter that society was in flux. And the flux allows change to happen much more easily than when society is stagnant and stable. That's an entirely unoriginal suggestion as to why it was possible to get rid of the bottlenecks, and why can we not learn those lessons now and make sure that the bottlenecks, which are created all around us, bottlenecks of large money, which stagnate enormously. You don't need large scale in order to innovate. Innovate can be done at a much smaller scale. It should be.
Yeah, Carl.
Well, I think a difference as well is that Britain at the time was very much exposed to geopolitical competition, and Britain realized that wages were relatively high, and so to deal with that, it needed to mechanize industry, and in order to do that, it needed to undermine the craft guilds, and in order to do that, it needed to invest in acts of parliament like the turnpikes to build roads and connect cities, and so the guilds all suddenly found themselves under pressure from other cities, and it also clamped down more directly on the guilds as a result of that. And so I think that geopolitical imperative is part of the reason for why the first industrial revolution happened in Britain, and Britain clamped down on the craft guilds earlier than other countries did on the continent, and I think that's a key difference.
And one of the vivid facts, if I remember correctly in your book, is that the use of the force of the state and the army to enable mechanization and suppress forces such as the Tolpol martyrs and people who are trying to destroy machinery, when in many other countries the anti-machinery movement won, meant, I think you say, that the deployment of the army in the 1820s and 30s to support mechanization was a greater force than was used by Wellington in the Napoleonic Wars. So that a degree of state power was needed to suppress the opposition to technological innovation. And it's a very powerful message. I see there's one last question, then I'm going to also wonder, then, as you ask a very quick question, then we'll turn to Carl to wind up.
Sorry, yeah, quick question on to what extent is it the nature of modern day technology that there just is larger barrier to entries because they're intangible investments, and for instance trying to compete with Meta on AI is almost impossible when they've been 10 years collecting data on every single person? And separate question just on the blockers, to what extent is it the fact that we don't share some of the benefits with the people who are doing the blocking that's caused the blocks? So if you think about building a data center, I think a lot of people would be like, well, where's the benefit for me? And that's why people are blocking building data centers.
Carl?
Those are both very good questions. So I think on the first one, so broadly speaking, there are two competing theories, right? And one is there's a lot of intangibles, and that's sort of probably barriers to entry. And one has to do around lobbying for protective regulation. And I think both of them have some relevance. I more firmly come down on the sort of regulatory bottlenecks in the book. In fact, I think a lot of the technologies that you see, including the cloud and the personal computer, make it much cheaper to actually start and run a business. And so in the end of the day, I'm not terribly convinced that technological changes is a key driver of the decline in that we see in dynamism. On the second point of making sure that people benefit, Britain has not been very good at doing that, I think, in the past. And my colleague and friend John Milbauer tends to remind me of the Land Compensation Act, I think, of 61, which means that essentially landowners appropriate all of the uplift of the value in land when you build infrastructure. And so I think you can put some more better mechanism in place to make sure that a broader share of the population benefit from those uplifts, then a lot is gained.
I think we should bring it to a conclusion. I'm going to ask you one last comment, which is an opportunity for you to give us an optimistic conclusion. I was trying to think of a question that might give us an optimistic conclusion. And one argument, which prompted actually by the penultimate question then, was there is massive geopolitical competition. And if you look at Ukraine's response to the invasion and the speed of innovation in drone technologies, and if you look in a different way at the kind of crisis in COVID and the speed of innovation in vaccination, a sense of competitive threat and challenge to your nation by an external force, be it an epidemic or a hostile power, isn't there, as the world sadly seems unstable and people worry about threats, will that not drive a dynamic of competitive innovation? And if you don't agree with that, can you think of another optimistic answer to give?
Well, I actually think it's a good point, and we've seen historically that Prussia's loss to Napoleon laid the ground for the Stein-Hardenberg reforms, and which included guilds being abolished and numerous other things. Russian defeat in Crimean War opened up for abolishing serfdom and other reforms, and so you can clearly make a case that this kind of competition can lead to productive reform. The question is, are we learning the right lessons from that or not? Because there's a tendency to tilt more towards protectionism and clamping down on national champions as well. So I'm optimistic that the right lessons can be learned, and the question is, are we doing it at the moment or not?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Carl. It's been great to have you here. Here is his excellent new book, and there are copies available upstairs at a bargain price for people who wish to get the full story. Carl, thank you very much for visiting us and explaining the thesis in your book.